Good morning, church. Well, this is strange, isn't it? Usually on Sunday mornings, this room is filled with brothers and sisters who are spending time encouraging each other, spending time giving hugs and laughing and sharing life, maybe sometimes even sharing tears and sharing each other's burdens. We gather together to sing and to pray, and we gather together to read and study God's Word, and most importantly, we gather together to surround the Lord's table and remember His death, burial, and resurrection. But this morning is different. This room is empty, and it's a strange feeling. And while we understand that this video may be awkward, it may come across awkward, it's definitely awkward for us to make this video. We want to do our part in order to help us as a church family stay connected. The elders and Jess and I want to spend our time together in this video trying to help each other remember, to remind ourselves about some important things. As human beings, we're forgetful people, and so our God, as our Creator, has given us many opportunities to remember. And so we want to remember His goodness at this time. We want to remember His faithfulness. We want to remember His promises. And we definitely want to remember the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, or the gospel. Sometimes we get scared when we fail to remember. And so that's why we want to spend these times together focusing on remembering. At this time, we want to encourage you to pause the video, and we'd encourage you to spend a moment in prayer. I think it's completely normal for you to lift up your individual prayer needs that you may have. But also, I'd encourage you to remember to pray for each other. We've been getting emails, hopefully, of different prayer needs that we have in our church family, specifically those who may be on the front line of some of this crisis time. So pray for other people as well. Spend some time praying for our church family and that we can stay connected during this time. The first story of the biblical narrative that we want to talk about today is the story of Queen Esther. You probably remember the story of Queen Esther. You might want to remind yourself by reading it again. It's about 10 chapters, and it's an incredible story from God's Word. And as we focus in on a certain part of this story, we want to see how Mordecai was approaching Esther at this time. He had learned in chapter 4 of Haman's terrible plan to destroy the Jewish people, and he was encouraging Esther to go before King Xerxes to save her people. And so he and Esther are sending messages back and forth through Hathach. And again, I'd ask you to pause the video at this time and read Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. And then ask yourself as you're doing that, what fear did God's people face at this time? Can you imagine the fears that Esther felt? There are so many unknowns. King Xerxes was a man who was emotionally unstable. He had already shown that in chapter 1 with his queen Vashti and how he got rid of her from being around him. And on top of that, what assurances, if any, had God shown to his people during this time? In fact, the whole book of Esther doesn't even mention God's name. It was a time of awkward silence between God and His people. And so I think that Esther needed some reassurance. I think she needed to be reminded. But listen to the words that Mordecai says to her in Esther chapter 4, verses 13 through 14. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you've come to the royal position for such a time as this." There, Mordecai encourages Esther to act in faith and to not act in fear. He reaffirms that God's in control. He even suggests that God may have allowed her to be in that position of queen for such time as that. Again, I want to encourage you to pause the video and to read Esther chapter 4, verse 15 through Esther chapter 5, verse 3 aloud, and be reminded how Esther showed her hope in God. And so we see Esther's faith and we see God's faithfulness. We're reminded that hope is greater than fear. But before we leave this story and Jess spends some time sharing with us about the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea, I want you to remember two things. First of all, when Esther chose to hope in God, she realized that she wasn't alone. Though she was separated physically from her people, her fellow Jews, she realized that they were still connected. And so the Bible tells us that she asked for them to fast for her and to pray for her. As a church family, we are separated physically, but we're still connected through Jesus. And as we individually choose hope over fear, remember that we're connected and keep praying for each other. And secondly, remember that Esther's past wasn't clear-cut. Yes, she did choose to risk her life, and yes, when she went before King Xerxes, he raised his scepter and he granted her request. But there was still a lot left to Esther's story. The decision was made, but to Esther, the ending wasn't clear yet. And I think that's also a great lesson for us. We will choose hope over fear today. And we will choose it again tomorrow, and we'll choose it again the next day and the next day. And like Esther, our story will keep unfolding as we walk through this together.
The next story we'll look at is found in Exodus 13 and 14. Take a moment to pause the video and read those two chapters, particularly Exodus 13 verses 17 all the way through chapter 14 verse 31 as a family. And as you read that, I want to ask you again to sort of ask some of those same questions as we did in the last story. Number one, what fear did God's people face? What assurance, if any, did God give his people? And finally, how did God's people show their hope in God? So if you could pause at this time and do that, we'll come back in just a second. I want to briefly share three things that I learned about hope during the study of this time and how that can apply to uncertain times that we may face. So as the Israelites are facing the reality that they'll be leaving Egypt for really the first time in 400 years, they are flooded with uncertainty. I'm sure they were asking several things about maybe where they would live, what they would eat, what they would drink, how safe they would be, where they would go, and those are just maybe a few of the questions. But because of all the miraculous things that God did during their exodus, they chose to have hope in what he was promising them, but it might not have been exactly what they were expecting. You see, from the beginning of the Exodus story, you can see God do something sort of unexpected. In verse 17 of chapter 13, God decides to lead the Israelites on a different path, a path that might not have made sense to anybody except God. We see that God led them on a longer path, a path through the desert, rather than leading them on a shorter path directly northeast to the promised land. When you choose to hope in God, it doesn't always make sense. God took the Israelites in the opposite direction of their destination because he knew he was leading them down the short, easy path would lead them right through Philistine territory. God chose to keep them from that burden, and with mercy, led them into the desert. Now, we all know from the story that God did some amazing things through his people during this time in the desert. He used it to prepare his people for the coming challenges that they would face as they enter the promised land. Though it might not make sense to the world, choose to have hope in God despite the uncertain times that we face. Once the Israelites leave Egypt and head towards the Red Sea, they soon realize that Pharaoh has changed his mind and was now only a short distance away. When they saw this, they cried out in fear, seeming to lose focus on that hope that they believed in, and instead gave in to their fear. Listen to how Moses responds in verse 13 of chapter 14. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." He goes on to say, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Moses' words were to stand firm, to be still, and the Lord will fight for you. He's helping the Israelites see that when they hope in God, they're taking all the pressure off themselves, and they're putting the pressure on God. We see that in this story, and we also see that really in the story of the cross. If my safety, my salvation, and hope for a certain future was all rested on my shoulders, I know that I would crumble under that pressure. During these uncertain times, I can have peace in choosing to focus on the hope that God provides because I know that He is for me, which makes His hope much greater than my fear. The final thing I learned about hope during uncertain times from this story is that choosing to hope in God really converts your fear of a situation into fear of a holy God. In verse 10 of chapter 14, sort of the beginning of this account, the Israelites said that they were terrified when they saw the Egyptians approaching. Then after God fought for them and showed them why they can trust in His hope, in verse 31 we see something different. We see that the people feared the Lord and put their trust in Him. Because of their choice to trust in His hope, their fear of the Egyptians was converted to fear of God. Now, we as Christians know that fearing God is much different than the feeling of fear that we face during certain situations. We know that fearing God is really a reverence or a great respect to how powerful and how awesome God truly is. When you choose to focus on hope, you're choosing to have a reverent and trusting respect of His plans, of His purposes, and His great love for you. In fact, you can see from the song that they sang in chapter 15 what kind of mindset flows from that trusting and that reverent respect of a loving and a holy God. Here are just a few lines from Exodus chapter 15 that show that. I will sing to the Lord, for He is highly exalted. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise Him. My Father's God, and I will exalt Him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is His name. Who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working in wonders? In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance. The place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, your hands established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. As the weeks progress and you are face to face with these strange times, remember that hope can seem weird to the outside world. That when you trust, when you choose to hope, you are really placing the pressure on God and not on yourself. And that when you hope, you are allowing your fear of a certain future to be converted into a fear of a holy God. And above all, remember that hope is truly greater than fear. This Wednesday, we hope that you'll join us again as we look at more topics about how hope is greater than fear, and specifically on Wednesday, we will look at why the reason that you have hope is much greater than the reason that you might have fear.
As we close with communion, I hope that you were able this week to get the bread and the fruit of the vine. If you weren't, please let us know. We have plenty here at the building. We can get that and make that available to you. We can deliver it to your house, or you can come by the building and pick it up so that you can participate in communion. As we think about communion, I think that many of us are going to realize that there's an element that we've taken for granted, and that is that yes, we are communing with God during the Lord's Supper, but we're also communing with each other. And in our communion time, there's not a whole lot of interaction between each other, but there is a great sense of comfort that comes from the fact that we're surrounded by people who are thinking about Jesus' death and burial and His resurrection. And that's something that is such a great comfort, and I think that that's going to be felt and missed more and more as time goes on. I love the analogy that Roger Hill used in his email this week. He said that when the city of Blanchard sends out a mass notification that water is going to be cut off, he finds himself almost instantly becoming more thirsty. And I think the same thing holds true with communion as well. As we think about communion, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the story that follows up what Jess shared with us, and that is after the children of Israel came up out of Egypt, they came to Mount Sinai, and while that was an awesome experience, that was also a terrifying experience of them to be in the presence of the living God. And as they are trying to process that and dealing with their fear, in Exodus chapter 24, we see a picture of how God reassures them and how God gives them an experience that is a great experience of hope. It says in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 9, when they're confirming the covenant that God's given them, that Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. And under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. But God didn't raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God. And then it has this phrase at the end of that verse where it says they ate and they drank. And I want you to think about that as members of the body here in Blanchard. I want you to think about what God could have done in that moment and what God did do in that moment to reassure his people. He wanted a relationship with them desperately, and he wanted them to be able to interact with him, and that's why he gave them the law. And as he does that, he brings them up to him, and he brings them up, and I'm not really sure what goes on there. It talks about them seeing God, and that's a kind of a confusing statement there, but he gives them a glimpse, I believe, of some hope that they needed at that time. Besides fire that's on the mountain, they needed a different picture. And so he calls them up to him, and as they're up there, I do find it very interesting that he didn't call them up individually. This wasn't just about Moses. It was something that he wanted to share with all of them. And so again, we each have that relationship with God. And what he does with them is he eats and drinks with them. And in many ways, I think this passage parallels what we're doing in communion. It's a time when we can remind ourselves about our connection to God through Jesus and through his death, his burial, and his resurrection. But it's also a time that we realize we're not in this alone. You may really have to work to picture being connected to each other this week as we're separated in our own homes. But I want to encourage you to do that. I want to encourage you to take some time to think about your brothers and sisters that you hadn't been able to see. And be reassured that while we are separated, we're still communing together. We're still spending time. We're still eating and drinking with our God. So we want to thank you for joining us. We want to encourage you to remember to stay connected, to check on your fold groups, and please let your group leaders or the elders or Jess and I know if you have any needs that we can help meet. Honestly, if you have needs that you know of that your neighbors or that your coworkers have, we'd be honored to try to help those as much as we can. We know it's a stressful time. Also, we've reached out to some of our song leaders, and we've encouraged them to look in the direction in which these lessons are going and to try to find some songs that are going to line up with some of the themes that we're talking about. That may be one of the things that we miss the most, just singing together. And so your family may be really comfortable singing together, and if that's the case, we'd encourage you to do that. But if you're not, we're going to include some links in this video that you can click on, and those are some a cappella videos, and we hope that that will encourage you in your time of worship to God. Thank you again for joining with us, and we want to tell you that we love you guys.